Good afternoon. My name is Justin Villere. We're back with Committee of 70's Election Day Studio C70 interviews with important policymakers, partners in the work that we do, voters, and in this case, one of Pennsylvania's best teachers. We're very excited to be joined by Shannon Salter, who is a social studies teacher in Allentown at Building 21. Shannon, thank you for being here. We're very excited to have you. And we're here to talk about civics.
We are.
Um,
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk about this with you today.
Wonderful. Great. So, among Shannon's many affiliations and projects, you were on the ground floor of the Educating for American Democracy roadmap with the basically the charge to create a set of standards and set of ideas around how we could better teach American students about civics education and government. And so, can you kind of talk about that? How that idea first came together and what your role in it is with
Sure,
EAD.
I'm happy to. So what it is, the Educating for American Democracy, or EAD roadmap, it's a framework for excellence in both civics and history education. It is inquiry-based. It is organized around sort of the essential themes and challenges of American life and history. And it offers a sequence that starts all the way in kindergarten and spirals up to the 12th grade. It is the roadmap and the pedagogy companion. It's not a curriculum. It's really important to talk a little bit about what it isn't when we talk about what it is. So it's not a curriculum or a prescribed set of standards. In fact, it is not at all intended to be implemented as a one-size-fits-all mandate for anyone. It is a call to action for sure, and it contains within it guidance so that high quality history and civics education can be implemented really on any scale. It could be used by an individual classroom teacher. It could be used district-wide in an entire school district or an entire school building. But it can also be used then as the basis for whole curriculum design or even standards revision across a state. So there's a lot of flexibility in it. But what drew it to me the most and what excites me about it is a framework that integrates both history and civics education together in order for students and adults to look at the world around themselves today and make well-reasoned decisions about what should we do next. Where are we? You really do need to integrate those two skills, combine them, and EAD really gives us a great framework for doing that. So that's what it is. You also asked me, where'd it come from? How did it
Yeah,
happen?
right.
I don't think anyone's going to be surprised when I remind you that, for decades, we've been in a decline in civics and history education, really just social studies education in general. And we can kind of look back to, if I were going to pick a moment, I would say that moment that Americans looked up into the heavens and saw Sputnik orbiting around the Earth and said, we need to retool our education system in defense of this threat. And so innovation and commitment to investment in STEM education, science, technology, engineering, math skyrocketed, as it has been doing ever since. So much so that if we arrive in around 2019, estimates are that investment in, at least on the federal level, in STEM education amounts to about $54 per student per school year. Spending on civic education, 5 cents. That's quite a gap, right? Civics and social studies in general are the least tested subject across the country. And we know, we test what we value and we invest in what we test. So the absence of accountability for civic education, the absence of investment in this subject, and not just pure money investment, but investment in teacher prep and professional development, curriculum design, and innovation, right? It's dwindled to almost nothing compared to comparable advances in STEM and literacy. Right. So after a series of sort of increasingly urgent reports on this matter, the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Department of Education put out a call and made financing available to develop a framework for renewing our investment in civics and history education. And so the EAD report, it started as a report, came out outlining a vision for how to do this, and then extended federal funding made it possible to transition from a report with a vision to an actual roadmap and a pedagogy that were ready for implementation. And so an incredibly large and diverse group that included scholars, it included researchers, educators, community partners, students, and parents, representing every possible element of American ideology, geography, different educational contexts, public, private, charter, homeschool even, came together to produce this work. And so really you can think about it as e pluribus unum in action, right? The roadmap brought together such a diverse and plural society with a shared vision for how do we prepare the next generation to sort of take over in our communities.
That's great. That's a wonderful background and kind of I like how you grounded it in history for how it the rise of the moonshot led
Mhm.
to this kind of decline in civics education. So it's really interesting. You talked about all the different stakeholders as well that had an input in this, and educators were one of those. And so,
Mhm.
what did that look like in practice, and why was it important to have teachers in the room helping lay out this roadmap?
Right. So while that decline was happening, right, it's not that social studies classes ceased to exist and stopped happening. For decades, educators in the classroom have been the frontline workers in preparing the next generation to participate in and sustain our constitutional democracy. Classroom teachers have not only been responsible for maintaining the best practices in social studies education, but honestly, a lot of the innovation has been happening just in silos in individual classroom contexts, as it has not been happening, or at least has lagged behind, sort of in our formal national structures around education. And so it's been teachers who have been innovating, have been responding to the changing needs of our students and our communities. One of the strengths of the EAD roadmap is that it wasn't a new model designed in a vacuum somewhere independent of the classroom, but it actually comes from the classroom, that it is a place that has brought together in one integrated model the best practices that have been happening in classrooms over the past several decades. Crucially important in order for something to be sustainable, in order for something to be able to be implemented in the field, that the field inform its development. I can share, if you want, my own personal journey as to how I came to the
Yeah.
place I am in EAD today is just an example about how it looks for teachers to participate in this. So
Yeah.
in the early days when EAD's authors were putting together the report and then developing the initial roadmap, I was a classroom teacher. And I was one of many who was contacted to participate in focus groups and share my ideas about civic education. What is it? What's happening now? What do I wish was happening? What do I imagine is possible? In the absence of a national and statewide really strong infrastructure supporting social studies education, teachers like me were often part of educator networks organized by curriculum providers and institutions of higher learning and others who were sustaining the work in the absence of sort of government implemented support. And so representatives from those organizations who were parts of the authors creating the roadmap in the first place reached out to those networks. And that's how they, collected teacher input and then started activating teacher involvement. And so my involvement deepened over time. I was part of task forces that were looking at curriculum and instructional design already in the field and evaluating it against the roadmap to say, how does this reflect what's already being done in the field? How might the things that already exist continue to evolve and grow to better reflect the idea behind the roadmap? And then once the EAD movement was ready to pivot from authoring to really implementing, disseminating and implementing the roadmap, one of the decisions they took was to expand the steering committee to include a permanent formal teacher position in the sort of voting decision-making part of the movement, and they invited me to join. And so I have been the teacher representative to the steering committee ever since. And in that role, I have co-founded and now chair a teacher leadership task force, which is both a way to facilitate elevating teacher voice and making sure it stays front and center in the work that we continue to do, as well as funneling resources to elevate teacher capacity to do what I'm doing with you today, which is, speaking for the work in the communities where we teach and help people understand what's possible.
That's great. Cool. From your perspective, what makes the roadmap different than other previous efforts to improve civics in history?
Sure. Well, I guess you got to go back to where we started, right? Most of us as kids, if we go back a generation, we can remember that often for many of us, social studies, which was mostly history,
Right.
was synonymous with a place where you went to memorize names and dates and places and battles. And even in the other social studies disciplines, government, or civics, whatever you called it, geography, economics, right? Those were isolated and separate disciplines from history class. And even in those classes, it was a lot of, you hear the facts, memorize them, right? And so those classes were often divorced from what I would say are the two most important questions you can ask if you're going to engage students, which is, why am I learning this? And how am I going to use it?
Right.
Right. And in 2013, I want to stop and give credit to a really important innovation in social studies teaching. The National Council for the Social Studies released the C3 framework, when C3 stands for College, Career, and Civic Readiness. And by 2013, this was a way to communicate that it was time to focus on restoring civic preparation to its important place in schools alongside what had become the primary thrust of schools, which was college and career prep. And the C3 framework changed how we think about teaching in the social studies in a really significant way, because it doesn't contain a content checklist. There's nothing in it that says, did you teach the War of 1812? Did you teach the Boston Tea Party? Instead, it is a skills-focused way of looking at the social studies. You know, in history, are you teaching students to analyze cause and effect? Are you teaching them to work with primary and secondary source documents? In civics instruction, are you teaching them to analyze enduring problems and challenges and assess efforts by individuals and groups to address them? But really, it kind of became a replace one with another model of innovation, in that gone was the content-focused model of instruction, replaced with an almost entirely skills-based instruction that was agnostic when it came to what content are you going to teach with it. EAD, the next iteration, provides guidance around both practicing the skills of civics and history with themes and challenges that help us identify and curate what content are we going to use when we practice those skills. So it integrates both of those things. And then it also talks about practicing them both together in the social studies classroom, and then extending their practice outside of the social studies classroom with a real model for civics across the curriculum, right? Practicing constitutional democracy in school communities across the curriculum. The pedagogy companion that comes with the roadmap specifically lays out what we call moves, things that school administrators and leaders can do, things that classroom teachers can do, even things that students can do to bring democracy to life and make their classroom civic, and their building civic preparation ready. So it's a real roadmap for just overhauling how we think, not just about how we teach civic preparation, but even where it happens in a school community.
That's fantastic. That's a really, really great overview, and interesting, kind of marrying the content with the skills, and something that you need to do both, right? As you
You
said.
do. And in fact, if you look where we are here in Pennsylvania, right, even we acknowledge PD. If you were to go up and look at social studies education, civics education, right, there's three pieces that civic preparation has to rest on. You need content knowledge, you need skills development, and you also need to build sort of the dispositions or the willingness to act in civic life.
Mhm.
And EAD doesn't pick just one of those pillars to focus on. It really creates an integrated framework for focusing on and addressing all three of those things.
Right. So here's a question that you and I bandy about a lot. A big challenge is how to encourage adoption without making it overly prescriptive, right? And so, how is the steering committee thinking about standards and accountability while keeping the roadmap voluntary? How's that balance being?
Right. And that's the biggest challenge, but it's so important, right? I mentioned that one of the obstacles to civic education over the past decades has been funding and has been a focus on STEM, but that's not the only one, right? The other obstacle has been deciding what to teach in the social studies classroom. We are living in a time of intense national polarization about the very nature of our past, the functioning of our democratic institutions, and it's nothing new. If we can go back to, there's an interesting story. I went back and reviewed the original EAD report, and there's an interesting story there. Back in the 1990s, on the 50th, around the 50th anniversary of the ending of World War II in the Pacific, the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum was planning an exhibit around the Enola Gay bomber. And at the same time, the country had undertaken this thought that maybe there should be national history standards. Let's give it a go. Well, those two conversations collided quite spectacularly publicly. What story are you going to tell about dropping the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? how much celebration and how much criticism of that moment are there going to be in that exhibit? And that conversation collided head on with this conversation of, can we impose national standards for history teaching that everyone has to follow? It got so bad that mass media took to calling it the history wars. And
Ooh.
by the time the national history standards got to the floor of the Senate, the vote was 99-1 against attempting to adopt any.
Mm.
And we've been shying away from this conversation ever since, which is another reason that civics and social studies education are in this state of decline. So the EAD framework is meant to be adaptable to local decision making, right? It is the embodiment of how to think, not what to think. And while it absolutely provides a framework of sort of best practices and guiding principles for making decisions, it also leaves a great deal of leeway for local decision makers and policymakers to make decisions about what is best for their specific community, for their specific classroom. And, you know, there's a lot of history in civics that we can choose from to still get students to be well prepared for their places in adult civic life. So why not, instead of trying to create consensus across the vastly diverse and plural society of America about one shared set of content list and skills questions, why not create a framework that allows local communities, allows even individual teachers and families to make some decisions so that they're best meeting the needs of the kids in front of them. I mean, I know I teach here in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and I'm very aware that what I might need to best serve my students here in Lehigh Valley, right, might be different than what students in Bucks County need, or Adams County, right? Allegheny, Erie, Forest, Susquehanna, take your pick. I imagine that we will best meet the needs of the students in front of us if we're able to taper and customize what we do to those students in front of us. And so it is super important. But that means we've got a lot more work to do, because you know, pass a mandate and put in place accountability measures and punishments for anyone who doesn't follow it. That's one way to make sure that universal adoption happens, and it happens quickly. But just like anything else you want to have happen in a democracy, this is going to take the work of convincing our constituents to take up the cause. And that's why I said earlier, like, the roadmap is as much a call to action as it is to anything else, because we're all going to have to pitch in to make this happen.
Yeah, that's helpful. Let's zoom out. What do you see the greatest potential of impact for the work that you're doing, for the work that, and here's a chance maybe we can touch on PA Civics a little bit. Is it through curriculum changes? Is it through policy advocacy? Is there something else, a kind of a amalgamation of all these? What do you think is
Yeah, you've hit the ultimate sort of supply side, demand side debate
right.
Of the world. And you can answer this from both a top down or a bottom up approach. And personally, I'm more of a two front thinker. My study of history has told us when we tackle something from two fronts, it tends to go better for us. So I'm a teacher, so I'm going to start in the classroom. I think that the grassroots bottom up approach is super important. And the good news is that with its flexibility, the roadmap doesn't need to be mandated at a statewide or even a school district wide level for an individual classroom teacher to find utility and start implementing it right away. So without waiting for what it takes to get policy reform or new curriculum written or new standards passed, individual teachers, departments of teachers, extended learning communities of teachers, they can all use the roadmap and the pedagogy to begin meeting the needs of their students right now. Right. The roadmap plays really well with other existing standards and curriculum resources, scope and sequence guidance, whatever it is that teachers are already beholden to and accountable to in their classrooms. The roadmap is flexible enough that these things can be integrated. So, you know, I'm working with teachers. I myself am a teacher who have integrated C3 framework resources, National Writing Lit Project resources, you know, textbooks from great publishers, supplemental resources from community partners like the National Constitution Center and iCivics and the Bill of Rights Institute, MIPA Challenge, so many others. They play well together. So from the bottom up, the roadmap's ready to be implemented by anybody who's inspired by it and understands it right now. But then it is also a great source of guidance for state level policymakers and curriculum writers, and it can be used as a framework to inform their development of new policies and standards. And the good news is that the potential for top-down impact from the roadmap is only enhanced when educators are already adopting it in the field, because in so many places, that top-down movement gets accelerated when policymakers notice that the change is already happening in the field, and they adjust their work around what the field is leading with. So I really do think you got to kind of go in both directions to get it done.
Nice. Well, now, last question. Looking ahead, what do you think success looks like for EAD? How can organizations like Committee of 70, PA Civics, how can we support the work that EAD is doing and what's happening in the classroom to help our students?
What does success look like?
Yeah.
Every single student in America being equally prepared for adult civic life. Not ambitious, am I? I want them all. I want
No, not
every
at all.
student
Yeah.
to have access to this. So I will share with you, EAD has articulated some goals, some metrics that we're hoping to be able to measure ourselves against. By 2030, the goal is 60 million students having access to high quality civic learning opportunities that include knowledge, skills, and dispositions, and not just one of those three things. 100,000 schools that are civic ready, that are ready to implement this, have created an entire ecosystem about supporting this kind of learning. 1 million EAD teachers, right? 1 million EAD teachers who are ready for this. So it's a call to action. Like I said, it will take all of us to happen. And the Committee of 70, especially through the PA Civics Project, is already here in the Commonwealth engaging in this work. I mean, we've been collaborating for over a year now, and I'm so proud of the work we're doing with, conversations with legislators and policy implementers here, trying to bring focus to this work, trying to bring Pennsylvania into these conversations about improving access to quality civic education for our students. This work takes resources, it takes funding, it takes coalition building. Like I said, because it's not a mandate, we need to build teams of people who are ready to raise the visibility of the work, to encourage decision makers in their communities to adopt it, to ultimately encourage the state, the Pennsylvania Department of Education, for example, to do what is needed to facilitate investment in a model like this. And it takes organizers like Committee of 70, like PA Civics, to help make those sort of things happen. And it's interesting because even though we talked about there's a partisan decide about what history should you teach and what do you say when you talk about it, the fact is that there's no partisan divide in America about the importance of the civic mission of schools, right? Recently, USC released a report showing a clear majority, regardless of ideology, that we need to be increasing our investment and focus on civic education and mandating and supporting that schools do more. So organizations like C70 can really turn that groundswell of support into tangible action steps. And we've been doing a great job. And honestly, what better gift could we give the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, for example, and the whole country as we approach our 250th year than a recommitment to educating for democracy? So, I'm just so grateful that there are partners out there ready to engage in the work with us and respecting that, teacher voices should really be helping lead the way. So I'm so grateful for the work we've been doing together and for this time today.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I like how you kind of honed in on the 250th. It's going to be a really exciting year in Philadelphia and in Pennsylvania next year as we celebrate what is it, the semi-quincentennial? Did I get that right?
You know what? I think everyone who says that word correctly the first time around deserves a little gold star from a teacher somewhere, because
That's right.
it's interesting that we're attempting
Long.
to live with a word for that as opposed to just saying the 250th. But
250th,
yeah,
right, exactly. But yeah, so it's going to be a fun year. We're really excited about the work that you're doing, and thank you very much today for joining us and for your continued leadership, both in the classroom but then outside, to help this very important initiative along. So thank you very much,
thank you
Shannon.
so much for your partnership and for the conversation today. I loved it. Thank you.
Happy Election Day.
Happy Election Day.